For over 300 years, blacks in America have been racially undermined by the government and barred from equal opportunity legally, politically, and economically. History shows blacks were the labor force responsible for the vast fortunes amassed in the United States and Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. However, blacks control only 2% of the wealth in the United States. Good evening and welcome to Detroit Black Journal. I'm your host, Darrell Wood. Coming up on this edition of the Journal, we will engage in a revealing interview with Dr. Claude Anderson, author of Black Labor, White Wealth. In part one of a two-part discussion, we will find out why American public policy, by design, has created a permanent black underclass. That's straight ahead on Detroit Black Journal. Thanks for joining me on this edition of the Journal. With me for this edition is Dr. Claude Anderson, author of Black Labor, White Wealth, and he is also president of the Harvest Institute. Dr. Anderson, thank you for joining us on this edition of the Journal.
Well, Darrell, thank you for having me here.
The Harvest Institute is a black think tank that has as its goal the reforming of American public policy as it relates to blacks.
That's correct. What we want to do is to get about the business for the first time in the history of this nation, design a policy that is strictly devoted to the economic and social reform of black America by giving them a national plan that would be proactive in resolving some of the major impediments and conflicts and developing broad racial strategies for dealing with white racism in this country.
A major thrust in that direction is the release of your new text, Black Labor, White Wealth. That book is incredible in the respect that it destroys myths, long-held fallacies, lies, and illuminates history and factuality as it relates to the black condition in America. And by that, more specifically, the institutionalization of racism is exposed for what it really is in American society. You kick over some sacred cows in this book, don't you?
Yes, I do. And that was my primary purpose. What I wanted to do, Darrell, in writing that book was two things. First of all, I wanted to send out a wake-up call to black America. And secondly, I want to prove three things. First of all, is that are blacks in the predicament that we're in, and have we been in this predicament for 400 years because what's been told us, first of all, that it was by divine decree, or that it was genetically inherited, or was it really social engineering? And I went back and found out that it's primarily social engineering. That black folk are in the predicament they're in because of social engineering. And what's happened to us all this time, Darrell, is that we've got locked into the lowest status of a no-win monopoly game. That means that we've had wealth in this country redistributed or maldistributed based on skin color going from the lightest to the darkest, lightest, yellow, brown, black. And the wealth has been skewed. So what happens in this country now is you got the white society controlling almost 100% of all the income, the wealth, the resources, the business, the corporations, the privileges, and all levels of government.
And therein lies the problem.
That's your
blacks.
problem. And the issue is race and resources. And black folk don't have the wherewithal to change their conditions.
And the reason that they have not historically in America had access is because of the way as you point out in the book, the legal system has been stacked against us, the political system has been stacked against us, the access to real property, wealth, money, land has been prohibited by law.
That's
the
right.
Supreme Court has been used as an instrument against us.
And it's still being used as an instrument against you.
Explain that.
Because initially, when the Constitution was written, all the Constitution did was picked up the old public policy that had already begun on black folk. When black folk first arrived in this country in 1619, there was approximately 20 blacks. By 1634, the Maryland colony came into existence. That time you had about 40, 45 blacks in the country. By 1638, something very profound happened, Darrell, that every black person in this country needs to understand. Something very, very profound. What happened in 1638? The Maryland colony put out its first public edict. And what that edict said is that black folks shall never enjoy the fruits of white society. That is very key to what's been happening to you for 400 years.
And that is written and established in American code.
That's right.
Codified as law in
That's
America.
right. And so, and between that point, let's say up for about the next 20 years, for instance, the European colonies were putting pressure on this country, saying, hey, we didn't send you to America to have a good time, just enjoy yourself and sit back and relax. We sent you to relax. We sent you to America to produce some wealth, some resources for our European, continent. And most of the colonies were sending letters back saying, hey, we can't do anything in this country. We don't have the wherewithal. It would take us a lifetime to clear the forest, to move the bricks, to get rid of the snakes and rocks. And we need a labor force to do it. And at that point in time, the white society knew they had a need. So what happened, they brought together a very strong sense of community around that need and said, we got to find a way of resolving that problem. And they looked back at that public edict was put out in Maryland in 1638, which says black folks should never enjoy the fruits of white society, and they expanded it. Right. So by 1664, 1665, every colony in the United States enacted a slave law that says black folks shall now constitute a subordinated, excluded, uncompensated, non-competitive, managed workforce for the personal comfort and wealth building of white society. And that became your public policy that remained in existence up until recent times.
Why isn't that taught in public education now? Why don't we know that?
Because what happened immediately after that, all the institutions jumped in and all the nations in this country jumped in to justify slavery, enslaving the black folk. And so the religious institutions said, well, we have to base it on something. So they said, let's base it on biblical principles, saying the Bible that the blacks were offshoot of Ham, so therefore God had decreed that black folks should be enslaved. And that stayed in effect for about maybe a couple of hundred years, about 100 and some years, and all of a sudden they moved over to the biological and said, well, blacks are just basically biologically inferior.
So from one rung,
that's what the bell curve is telling you about now.
And the bell curve, of course, is the controversial book assaulting black intelligence as genetically inferior.
That's right.
As the author alleges.
That's right.
Is the case.
That's an extension of that original public policy that was put into place back in the 16th century.
As an extension of that public policy, I think the key here is public policy. What you've talked about and outlined in very brief form is how public policy has been designed in this country around the suppression of a singular racial group.
That's right.
I want to deal with some definitions.
Okay.
Public policy was used to the extent that black people would be suppressed. Coming forward in time, blacks thought that the great salvation of the race could be summed up in one word: integration. Is that true?
Yes. And let me go pick up that public policy and bring you up to that. That public policy stayed in effect until, let's say, 1705, for instance. In 1705, it was codified into what we call the slave codes. And the slave code said at that time defined how in the future all whites would behave and how blacks would behave. And that's why what they call the Southern ethics, where blacks could not challenge whites or raise his hand to defend himself against a white person.
And in fact, white people were told that it was their duty, in fact, to suppress and severely handle blacks in order to enforce the status quo, or they themselves would be considered lawbreakers.
Right. In other words, they violated the code, the white code. And see, in that time, what the code said is that every white must enforce this code. Every religious institution must subscribe to it. All levels of government must be responsible to it. Okay, it must be passed on through your social customs, Daryl, and also through your laws. I put a lot of those laws in the back of the book. Right. Okay, and once that was codified in 1705, everybody understood the law. Then by 1710, for instance, Virginia then said, now that we have a unified white community, they then broke up the black community by passing what they call meritorious manumission in 1710. And what that says now is to make sure that blacks never have a strong sense of community, a unified self, we will grant meritorious manumission. That's why all these southern states had meritorious manumission laws to any black who goes against his own people.
Which in effect said that blacks could be freed.
That's right.
To enjoy rights and privileges in the society for becoming traitors to their own race.
Right, as a free black. But it would never could be comparable to a white.
Right.
So when that law was passed, then we found that a black could be rewarded for squealing another black, what we call crabbing. And out of a possible 150 so-called insurrections or revolts, slave revolts, a black person squealed in every one of them. Okay, and he was rewarded for squealing on blacks. That's where you get the crabbing in the black society.
Which is why there was virtually never a successful black
revolt.
Right.
But see, and that kind of a system was never used against any other group in this country. No other group, Chinese, Hispanics, or any other group.
Well, you make a strong case in the text for the singular selection, the purposeful separating out of people of the black race for this kind of treatment on this continent.
To make sure there was never a strong sense of community, because a strong sense of community was a threat to the white society. I remember that public policy said you should be non-competitive. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, the only monument right now in this country that I'm aware of that even recognize and honor the black for being that kind of a black is still in existence up in Harper's Ferry. You know where John Brown had his raid that night?
Sure.
If you ever go up there right outside the hotel, there's a big brown box there. And there's a big monument carving to the black slave who jumped off the porch the night John Brown's troops entered the town, mm-hmm. and John Brown killed him. The town erected a monument to the Sambo, saying this is the kind of black we like.
Going from the historical codifying of suppression of blacks to the point where we had a civil rights movement in this country. The first civil rights movement is not the one that gets talked about very often. In the book, you talk about the first time blacks were freed, mm-hmm. and you talk about how that freedom was really an illusion. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that? Why weren't blacks free after they were emancipated following the Civil War?
Because first of all, what they gave blacks was three things. First of all, they set him free. Mm-hmm. And secondly, they gave him a supposedly 14th Amendment due process, mm-hmm. and a right to vote. And but those things had no power attached to them. Blacks, mm-hmm. could not protect themselves with that, because see, everything in the society was based on your ability to be able to take care of yourself. Mm-hmm. And so blacks were set free at that time, naked, penniless, ignorant, defenseless, mm-hmm. without clothing, animals, livestock, land. Mm-hmm. And so they were abandoned. And you gave him civil rights and the 14th Amendment. Mm-hmm. He couldn't use them. See, first of all, let's take the 14th Amendment, which is now the ones we hear a lot about. Between 1866 and let's say the 1900s, mm-hmm. that 14th Amendment was used 319 times, okay? Mm-hmm. Out of that, 314 times was by corporations, not blacks. Mm-hmm. Blacks used it about 4 to 5 times, and guess what happened? They lost every time. Mm-hmm. Blacks never used the 14th Amendment until 1954. But all major corporations use it. That's when you hear about corporation now being an entity, a person.
Or a person.
They used that 14th Amendment that was given to blacks, mm-hmm. then gave it to the corporations. And what they did, and immediately in 1870, they took blacks' rights from them, mm-hmm. okay? Because they didn't have any power.
So once again, the rights were basically suppressed.
They were just suppressed.
That which had been written into law was now effectively thrown out
because blacks couldn't protect themselves. They had no power. And also what had happened at that point in time is that between 1619, when blacks first came in the country, and until the emancipation, mm-hmm. all the wealth in this country and all the power was built around the black slave himself. That's where your money and power came from. Contrary to what people keep talking about, well, you know, land is the most important. Land was never important. Mm-hmm. Land, Darryl, was totally useless without blacks. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, President Jackson said that blacks brought 75% of the value to land. Mm-hmm. You can come in this country, an immigrant, go any place you want to find all the land free. Mm-hmm. You can just drive a stake in the ground and say, I own from here to that next street. Nobody cared. It had no value. Mm-hmm. It only had value when you put black slaves on it. Mm-hmm. And that's why all the wealth was concentrated in the South. As a matter of fact, in 1860,
right.
out of 66% of all the persons in this country had over $100,000 worth. Mm-hmm. We're in the South.
Right.
As a matter of fact, and out of the 5 million blacks who were enslaved, mm-hmm. they had a net investment value of over $8 billion. That $8 billion was more wealth than all the other corporations and federal government put together.
Sure.
As a white man in the South who had 2 black slaves was richer than any person in the North. If you threw the average person in the North, I threw in his house, his business, his land, his clothes, his net worth, and his bank account.
Mm-hmm. Well, primarily because it was free labor.
It was free labor. It was free labor.
You worked them until they died.
That's right. And the thing with a black is you had to work him unto death, mm-hmm. but you could not let him grow old.
Right.
Because you had no way of taking care of him.
Economic liability.
That's right. He became a liability. You had to work him to death early.
Seeing then that the policy was set to keep blacks in a place of servitude, cheap or free labor, mm-hmm. the country set about to make a set of rules, enforce them through institutions, government, the courts, and basically ensure that blacks through the immigration process would not grow to equal or majority status in the population. In the book, you outline that we're built in as a, quote, minority, unquote, never to exceed a certain statistical level.
Right. In the early part of the 1700s, black slaves became such a good thing. Everybody was hauling black slaves into the country, and from Africa they shipped approximately, from most of the research I can get, somewhere between 35 and 50 million blacks out of Africa. Over 2/3 of those died en route and in capture. But in this country, the black slave population, let's say, hit its peak about the 1750s. We had over 34% of the general population of this country was black at that time. That scared this country to death. They found out that the number reached that high. And in the southern states like Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and Georgia, the population of blacks had gone up somewhere between 55 and 60%. And they said, and so what the colonies started doing then was started saying to England, and remember now, England was franchising slavery. They set up a franchising system for slavery. They were making all the money and the wealth. Most of the wealth of this country was going to England, because England passed laws saying this country could not produce anything except cash crops and send it to England. England would manufacture it, and send it back and sell it back to them. Right. And that's what the Revolutionary War was over. The Revolutionary War was over black people. The wealth that black people were producing in this country, in cotton, textile, rice, indigo, tobacco, and molasses, syrup, sugar. That's what the fight was over. But the black population hit somewhere around 34%. And after the Revolutionary War, they said the first thing we're going to do is to make sure we get that black population down, because it's a threat to us. So in 1790s, right after the Revolutionary War, the first act of the new Congress was to enact what we call the first naturalization and immigration law, which says this is a white country, white man's country, period. And we slapped a zero quota on blacks in this country.
No other group had the kind of quotas or limits in terms of immigration to this country placed on them. The blacks did.
That's right, because they did not want blacks to be a threat. And that's why they also passed manumission laws to stop anti-manumission laws, saying that we do not want more than 2% of the blacks in this country to be free slaves at any particular time. And that's why a lot of people could not free their slaves, because they were threatened by the free slaves. Because the worst thing in the white society's mind was an uncontrolled, unmanaged black person, because it violated the public policy on blacks. And so they stopped a lot of people from freeing the slaves. But those immigration laws is part of your problem that you have now in Haiti. So they don't want to raise that immigration. The present population in this country with blacks is 12.3, which is exactly what it is for Africans in the world, 12.3. And with the black population of Africa, the world population. But also it's important to know that that's why integration won't work, for the same reason.
Now, you come forward in time to the question. Now, the book spends a lot of time outlining the historical problems facing blacks. Spends a lot of time talking about what's wrong for blacks in America, as well as what's wrong with blacks in America. Lest people think that this is strictly a history lesson, let me rush in to say that the book is filled with exposition on solution-oriented plans and strategies for turning this situation around. It doesn't necessarily call for violent overthrow of the government either.
No, we don't do that.
It is not. And let me ask you this question. It's not an assertion of socialistic or communistic principles, is it?
No. See, the basis of the book is saying that black people's future is in their past. You have to understand it. And secondly, from my perspective, see, I've never had any inclinations towards socialism, nationalism, any other ism. My only ism is blackism in this perspective, that I want black folk. I see myself as an empowerment pragmatist, saying how do we get from where we need to go as quickly as possible to save ourselves from becoming a permanent underclass in this country by the year 2013.
And one of the ways that you say will not work
is
integration.
Okay, integration
But
won't.
black people think that integration is the way to go, and white folk have thought forever. Liberal white folk have thought that integration is the way to go.
Oh, sure. If I was white too, because I really got you boxed in now. See, because that public policy, let me go back to that public policy again. At the turn of the century, that public policy was picked up by our organization, NAACP and Urban League. They saw it and they said, now we're going to come into existence and try to help black folk. What can we do? They were only permitted to help black folk in the context of the public policy. The public policy said black shall be a managed labor force. So the precepts of the Urban League and the NAACP was to help black folks find equal employment opportunity. See what I'm saying? And by the mid-1920s, Garvey and somebody said, hey, hold a second, how about some economic? And they said, no, that's out. And so we could never move blacks into starting their own businesses as a national public policy. So in the mid-1920s...
Because again, the law stipulated that blacks cannot have businesses compete with whites
they couldn't
or
compete.
do anything that would bring profitability to blacks and take it away from whites.
Either through they utilize legal and extra legal means to keep blacks out. In many cases where blacks, you see, nobody in this country was more qualified, for instance, raising tobacco and raising cotton than black folk, okay, and taking care of livestock. In many instances, they would even poison the blacks' livestock. They would burn his cotton, burn his wheat. So blacks could not, and that's why if you look in the back of the book, you see all kind of laws that says blacks should not compete with blacks and compete with whites in a whole number of things. But by the mid-60s, what happened in the middle of the civil rights movement, Darryl, was that contrary to what's popularly taught, black folk didn't get free in the mid-60s. What happened at that point in time was that that technology finally caught up with that labor need for blacks. And for the first time, the public policy said, hey, we no longer need blacks to open doors and shine shoes and wash dishes and mop floors. We got technology that can do it. And when that happened, something very profound happened again to the public policy. And what they had to do then was say, the white society said, aha, now we've got to change this public policy. So what they said is that now that we no longer need blacks, what we have to do is go into a new period called benign neglect, okay, or callous indifference, or out of sight, out of mind. So then they said, so Monahan came up with a policy by the late 60s saying, or early 70s saying, it's time for us to move from focusing on black folk to focus on Indians, Hispanics, and women. But they also said what we must do in our new public policy is, first of all, make sure that all of our public policies at every level express no guilt for what has happened to black folk. Point one is pivotally important. Point two is that we show no responsibility or obligation to help blacks in any manner. Okay? Which means affirmative action and anything else. Point three is to make sure nothing is done to transfer that wealth that I told you, that 100% wealth on one side of the sheet over to blacks, that never occurs. And that is what we've been locked into from the mid-60s up to today.
But once again, the civil rights movement focused on integration. The civil rights movement said if we can move into their neighborhoods, if we can go to schools with them, if we can sit at the same lunch counters with them, then we'll make the breakthroughs we need to make to end this codified evil called racism.
Because we had been pursuing, since that original mandate in 1638 excluded us, saying black folks should never enjoy the fruits of white society, that's been locked in our mind to enjoy the fruits of white society. So we want to integrate. But nobody else in this country has ever wanted to integrate. What they want to do is assimilate. They've always had the option to assimilate by the second generation.
The difference being?
The difference being that they can move in and blend in. They can intermarry and blend in, and by the second generation you can't tell who's who. Or they can have the option of setting up a little Haiti, or a little Havana, or a little Cuba, or a little whatever you want, or a little Italy. But black folks wanted to integrate, and integrate killed us for a number of reasons. I'll try to get these points in very quickly. One, first of all, integration is nothing but a new modified form of segregation. Only thing now, you've broken your people down to a smaller unit, and you defied the first premise of power, which is you no longer have numerical power. Now you're in little small groups all around large urban areas. That's point one that's going to knock our brains out. Point two is that the white society maintains what we call a racial balance, or what we call a tipping point, which says that I will accept black folks primarily at 0, but I would tolerate them anywhere from up to 5 to 8% of any given population. But the minute they cross that 5 to 8% population, it is no longer integration, it's now invasion, and I must take action against it. So I'll either take my kids out of school, put my house up for sale, move my business to the suburbs, or I will resign from the organization, okay? Because I'm not going to let him get that dominance over me. Third thing that immigration is done for you, it destroyed all your major businesses, because they used the highway system to drive expressways right down the center of every black community in this country. And where blacks used to have major business opportunities in the country, they were all destroyed. 4, we find that also we got a major capital drain. There's a basic rule in economics which says you must spend your money in your community and make it bounce 8 to 12 times before it leaves. Black money never bounced one time. Black folk have approximately $300 billion passing through our hands annually. That money doesn't even bounce in our communities.
There are other things that you mention in the book that are evils to black empowerment. We don't have a lot of time left, but in the closing moments, I just want to throw out some key terms that you express in the book and get your very brief reaction to them. First of all, black empowerment is not the same as empowerment, is it?
No.
Why?
No. Because empowerment, in my definition, means giving people the psychological feeling of competence and ability to compete. Now, keep in mind, and I told you back on that public policy, they did just the opposite in the conditioning system, was to tell you that you could never compete with the white society, and that they passed laws that restricted you from competing, and they also, in their conditioning element, they made you see your future and your well-being only through the eyes of the master, okay? And so when I talk about self-empowerment, I'm talking about how do you get my people to be able to feel self-confident, that they can pick up resources and be just as competitive as any other group.
Group economics.
Group economics. We have to start practicing group economics, which means you're going to have to start spending you got to quit, you got to stop the flight of black capital out of this community, out of our communities. Presently what's happening is black folk are spending 95% of our money in the suburbs, okay? And we leave about 3%, 5% in the community. 3% that goes to non-black businesses. Blacks are left with 2% of their annual disposable income. It is humanly impossible for you to live off of 2% of your income. So what happens now is that we've enabled the white community to live off of 2 incomes, to live off of 100% of their income and 95% of blacks' income. Okay? Because both the white community and the black community are boycotting black businesses. That is the primary thing that's killing black businesses. It's not the fact that blacks don't know management, don't know cost analysis, accounting, control, or personnel management. It's because both the black and the white community are killing blacks' businesses by boycotting them. We also know we don't practice quid pro quo in politics, which means you got to say to your people in an election, what can you do for me whether you're black or white if I vote for you?
Right.
And presently the system is that since black folk are subordinate to and excluded from the system, we can only do what's mainstream. And if they do what's mainstream, nothing's going to happen for black folk.
Blacks must reach a point of self-determination by the year 2015 in your analysis.
That's right.
Why?
Why? Because at that time, about 7, 8 major things that's going to wipe us out if we don't do something very quickly about getting some power and wealth, rebuilding our communities and being competitive. One, we anticipate in the next by the year 2013, approximately 8 to 6 million Hispanics entering this country and 41 million Asians. We have been the #2 population in this country now for approximately 400 years. We're going to be pushed from #2 down to #4, okay? Now, if you didn't get anything for 400 years when you're #2, you figure what you're going to get when you become #4. You're not going to be you're going to have to now speak through 2 other groups. Secondly, crime is going to be a cold word for blacks. Blacks are going to be further criminalized than they are now.
Right.
Next thing's going to happen to black folk. We're going to be forced into what we call a new world order. We're going to have to compete with groups all over the world that we're totally ill-equipped to compete with. But let me get to one other point very quickly.
Right.
Let me skip off that a second.
Very quickly.
So, because one of the things I want blacks to also focus on is civil rights. You missed that question about civil rights.
Right.
We got to get away from civil rights because that's not the major issue. Civil rights won't give you any power. Neither will integration, because black folk have been so psychologically, so politically, and so economically damaged, Daryl, by 400 years of deprivation and exploitation, that civil rights and integration won't even reach us. We can't be reached by it, and it can do nothing for us. As a matter of fact, even if you're going to talk about civil rights, then switch it. Right. Instead of talking about, look, gays talk about gay rights, handicaps, handicap rights, females, feminist rights, veterans, veteran rights.
Right.
And when you get to black folk, why do you talk about civil rights? I don't know any blacks named civil. Talk about black rights.
Okay.
Instead of talking about social integration, talk about economic integration.
The book is Black Labor, White Wealth, The Search for Power and Economic Justice. Claude Anderson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Daryl, for having me.
And of course, you are watching Detroit Black Journal.